we don't have any less talented people than anywhere in the country. I'd say the entrepreneurial spirit of Scousers and from people in the city region is writ large. But what we've suffered from for far too long is a lack of opportunity. So we're creating those opportunities. And as we do that, you can almost organically see, these things start to grow.
Welcome to the Social Mobility Commission podcast series, episode 14, Social Mobility Talks. My name is Alun Francis. I'm the chair of the Social Mobility Commission, and it's my great pleasure today to be in the Liverpool City Region, where I'm meeting Mayor Steve Rotheram, who's been in charge here since 2017, and we're going to talk about what social mobility means in this part of the country. Right, welcome, Steve. It's a great pleasure to have you on our podcast and a chance to talk about social mobility and what it might mean for Liverpool City Region. So, and in particular, I'm interested in both the geographical aspects of social mobility and opportunity and place, which we've talked about a lot, but also your personal background is really interesting for us in terms of social mobility because you followed a different route post-16 to the majority of people in public life, and I think that gives you a very different perspective, so it'd be really interesting to hear what your views are about some of the things we've been trying to do with the Commission and where a future social mobility policy perhaps should focus its efforts most.
I didn't choose necessarily the route that I've ended up taking. I would much have preferred at that young age, if I could go back and speak to a young Steve Rotheram about doing more in school and trying to achieve something that would then lead on to an academic route. But I wasn't ready. And for me, I couldn't wait to leave school, and it was just the wrong time for me to be concentrating on education and perhaps a route into further education or into higher education. I wanted to play football, and I wanted to play for Liverpool Football Club, as most kids do. So I very much, when I go to schools, I can relate and empathise actually with a lot of those low expectations. And what we want to do is to try to go in and tell people that there is a world out there and raise those ambitions for young people, because we have far too many who leave school with basically either very, very low qualifications or no qualifications whatsoever. And then as a combined authority, we try to pick them people up and get them qualified and skilled to move into the world of work. And I think that sort of opportunity to relate to their lives has been important. But I also think that as a system, we far too often try to squeeze square pegs into round holes. And I remember the Blair government and what they tried to do with getting the 50% of people to go to universities, a really laudable aspiration. The problem was, I think at the time, as a party, we forgot about the 50% that weren't going to go into academia. And I want to have an equal policy for people to either achieve through a technical qualification or through academia. And I think that's what we're trying to do and pull together in the Liverpool City Region.
Great. So we unpack that a little bit, because I remember my teaching experiences in Liverpool. I taught at Liverpool John Moores many years ago in the 1990s, and I remember then most of they were the best classes I ever had in any of the teaching I did, and it was because we had most of my classes of mature students coming back in to education. They were either men who'd been made redundant, and they brought all their trade union experience and their knowledge of the workplace. I was teaching them history and politics, and they just made the debates really rich because they brought so much to it. Or women who'd had children coming back into the labour market. But even then you felt that the choices are too narrow. And I think certainly one of the things we focused on in the Commission is most social mobility policy in our country, and the way social mobility became part of policy under the Blair government and then later governments after that, the common theme was it's really about what we would call the kind of lucky few model. It's very much about elite universities, elite occupations, which actually for most of the country means leaving home. It's a model that's kind of worked well. Our data tells us for London, if you're going to grow up poor, London's probably the best place to grow up poor because the education system works differently, the opportunities are better. It's not saying it's all the same for everybody, but you can definitely see that pathway better. But when we look outside, it doesn't work in that way. I've been really interested the way that you and Andy Burnham in your book last year, Head Start, which I think it has some really interesting, Head North, yeah, quite, Head Start's a different thing. Head North is some really interesting ideas there about what needs to be done to equalise opportunity across the country. But one idea in there is this notion of dual pathways.
Yeah.
And I think that's what you're talking about, where technical and academic together. But of course, the other big challenge we've got, which is accelerated even in the last year, is AI and what the implications of that are going to be. So what's your sense really of how important are those dual pathways to Liverpool City Region, and in particular, given the changes in the labour market that we know are coming?
Well, we won't see the improvements in educational standards and in the skills levels unless we do something different. You know, it's that Einstein thing. So we have to look at how can we genuinely achieve parity of esteem between those different routes. And at this moment in time, if you've got, I don't know, a lower degree from Oxford or Cambridge, or an MVQ level 7, I'll bet you most employers would go for the Cambridge graduate. And so we have to do something to spell out that actually a technical route gets you to the same educational standard, but it gives you the real world experience, because you'll be in the company, learning through their ethos and the way in which they operate. So I think, depending on your type of learning, and I'm a kinesthetic learner, so I think what we try to do far too often is pigeonhole people, and therefore, if we need people to switch between academia and technical qualifications, it's quite difficult, as you know, to map some of that over. And then funding becomes problematic because you've used some of your credits on one and not all of that. We need to be looking at a person holistically and what would be in the best interest of that individual. And that's why, for me, what I'm trying to do is to speak to employers and to try to get really good opportunities for people with both routes that are dependent on how that individual wants to pursue a career, and not on necessarily just trying to get numbers in colleges or higher education institutions or whatever it is. So funding's really, really difficult. But we think, both myself and Andy, he's introduced something called the MBAC. But we've already had something, pathways, into work for some considerable time. But it's both of us trying to address the imbalance that we currently have within the educational system.
That's fascinating, and I think another interesting part of that another part we're very interested in is the notion that around enterprise as well. So if I think about all the people I know who have started and set up a really successful business, honestly, all the 3 or 4 most successful ones all started with a vocational route. So one of my board members at Blackpool the Fire College yesterday, I went to see her. She's got a very successful company, it's a finance support company for SMEs and so on. She started with a BTEC in business. She hasn't got any other qualifications. She's learned things as she's gone along, but what she's got is that practical, applied, ability. But I could give you a load of other examples of similar things, and I just sense sometimes that that's not a big enough part of the story. Encouraging people to think, actually, it's not always just about working for somebody else. It's about, we need more enterprise innovation. We need people setting up businesses, offering employment, and that's not a big enough part of the education system either.
It's not, and you said about the practical applied ability. That's the main thing for me. So I started as an apprentice bricklayer, as you know, and there were MVQs then. Going back, the sort of generation before me had a different route, but ours were MVQs, and then we went on to hires and all that sort of, and then OND and HNCs and all that. That's the route that we took. But it's some of the things that you learn in a technical education have stayed with me throughout my whole life. It doesn't matter what job role I've taken. So, simple things like when I was a bricklayer, you'd go in and you'd have to problem solve, because no 2 sites were the same. So that stays with you. You had to work with others. You have to be able to communicate. And so, tomorrow when we come in, so you have to plan obviously being numerate was really important, because I also went on to be a trainer, and I used to teach people Pythagoras theorem, but they didn't know it was Pythag theorem, because we had to build square corners on walls and stuff like that. So I'd teach them the 3, 4, 5
And the maths used to put a roof on a building, extremely complicated practical
It's
math.
all of those things are just things that you pick up. So they've stayed with me throughout my life, and I don't think that we put enough emphasis on those, that applied learning, that is a benefit that you can carry forward forever.
I think that's fascinating when we're also considering things like AI, because for years we had the view that modern technology, actually what it did was de-skill practical skills. AI reverses that, because actually it's intellectual skills that it's making into routine operations. And actually the jobs probably that are the least likely to be replaced are exactly as you described. It's the problem solving aspects of bricklaying, construction, hairdressing. Those are things they're not routine, because every situation's different. So it's an interesting inversion, isn't it, of the kind of traditional model. And I know you're doing some interesting things about AI in schools. Do you want to tell us a bit about those?
Yeah, this is a fascination for me. And the first thing is, I understand that at a national level and a national level, there have to be guardrails put in place because of the sort of dystopian future that some people paint about robots taking over and we're all going to be doomed. And I get that. And that's a serious thing that we have to ensure we get right. But what I can do as a Metro Mayor is to see whether we can use it as a tool to improve not just the educational standards or necessarily the types of jobs, but the economic opportunities within the Liverpool City region. And I went out to New York to speak to a company called Kyndryl, and everybody was after Kyndryl. Or every other Metro Mayor was after Kyndryl. They chose to come to Liverpool because we're starting to develop things here that are just not available anywhere else. So I had 2 assets. One of them was called the Hibernia Link at the time, which was the link between the UK and North America, but it just lay in isolation. It was actually a depleted asset. And at the other end, literally the other end of our city region, is a place called Daresbury. And at Daresbury, we've got the Hartree supercomputer, which is the most sophisticated and powerful industrial supercomputer in the country. And I thought, well, what happens if you join these things together, which we've now done, and it's called LCR Connect. That's the thing, the infrastructure that has created the interest from outside, because now we have the ability for big data analytics. We have the fastest speed in the country. We have a link directly to North America. So all of these markets are opening up. And when I did go to speak to Kyndryl, I could tell they were interested, and they've set up here with 1,000 jobs. Now, what's the product of that 1,000 jobs? It means that our graduate retention rates have gone from being some of the worst in the whole country to the 3rd best, because we're now offering real opportunity. And it's not just grads, of course. We're getting apprentices that are coming through this. So I see AI as, of course, being a challenge, but a massive opportunity, and somewhere is going to do all of these things. So why shouldn't it be the UK? And then why shouldn't it be the Liverpool City region as part of that?
Brilliant. Brilliant. So we've talked quite a lot in recent times in social mobility around the importance of the economy. And it's something we felt that previous social mobility commissions had ignored. They'd assumed the economy was as it is, and then they kind of worked within that envelope. But what that basically means is you do focus your efforts on saying, well, actually, most of the jobs are London-based. Most of the growth sectors have been finance, professional services, and so on. And the geography and the regional disparities bit of that's been overlooked. So we've produced a couple of reports on the importance of innovation, not just to economic growth, but actually how innovation also supports social mobility, because it's disruptive. It creates new opportunities for new businesses, new skills. It's all of those kind of aspects. And as you say, it's got a negative side. You could see it as a threat, or you could say, actually, that's the way the economy's always developed. So how can you work with the flow of that to make that work as well as possible? If we're looking out the window here, I was saying to you before we started, I find it. I mean, we're sat in this amazing office. If people on the podcast can't see it, but we're overlooking the River Mersey, and we're overlooking the whole transformation of Liverpool. And if anybody's not been to Liverpool, come and see it, because it is just phenomenal. I remember coming in the 1980s when the docks were in decline, and it was an extremely scary place to come. And you look out now and think, that is absolutely amazing. I think that when I go to Manchester, well, I live in Manchester. I think that when I go to Leeds, I can see parts of that in Birmingham and other cities. But, and clearly, innovation, economic growth is central to creating better opportunities, and you've described that really well. Does it go quick enough? And what do we need to make it go faster? Because when I look and think, so Manchester's plans have been over 30 years. That's a life. That's almost a person's working life. Liverpool, the same. Why is it so slow? Why does it take so long? And then we'll come later perhaps to talk about the overspill of this to the broader areas around where they're probably not developing as quickly as here. But what would make it go quicker, and does it need to go faster?
Well, to both of those final questions, yes. So why did Manchester get to where they currently are? That, and because it's a sort of a live example of economic growth, but socio-economic benefit as well, because of the things that the Mayor Andy Burnham is doing there. So I think that's where we need to get to. We've caught up. I mean, we're not there yet, but we are fast narrowing that gap between what they've been doing for 30 years and what we've been doing for 8 years here. And innovation has to form a part of the future for industry and for the economies across the UK. But because we have devolution, we can start to shape what that looks like. And it's not the same in Greater Manchester as here or in Leeds and Sheffield and London. For us, we've got some real critical advantages, and we need to capitalise on them first. So, for instance, Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine is the oldest school of its kind in the world. And what we want to do is to look at the spin-outs from that. And Icon have had, I think it's 100 different spin-outs. Some of the industrial benefits of that, you know, trying to keep as much as we possibly can with the production of things in the Liverpool City Region, have meant that graduates are retained and we can attract some of the clever people from other places. So that's part of it. But one of the things that I did under the last government is I agreed to have something called an investment zone, and we had a free port zone as well. And I pull those two things together into an innovation zone. So actually now we can attract some of the big companies and the blue chip companies and the ones that everybody would like to have on, you know, their lists. We can attract them because we have all of the mechanisms by which they get obviously incentives to come here, but the pipeline of talent is really important. And I keep on saying to government about, if they give us the opportunities, we can do far more than a monolith down in Westminster to respond to those local issues. And that's because we don't have any less talented people than anywhere in the country. I'd say the entrepreneurial spirit of Scousers and from people in the city region is writ large. But what we've suffered from for far too long is a lack of opportunity. So we're creating those opportunities. And as we do that, you can almost organically see, you know, these things start to grow. So you'll see the innovation zone that we've got is huge. And we don't just want to be bystanders in this. We want to be facilitators. So literally this week, I interviewed for the first AI chief officer in the country, and they will be starting in a few weeks' time. So we'll have somebody who's using AI, data, innovation, all of those scientific benefits, but to generate some wider community benefits for the people in the Liverpool City Region, and also then to use the brand to get out there to the the FDI that we need, the foreign direct investment, to try to attract other companies to come and set up here.
That sounds brilliant. That sounds something we'd definitely like to come back and find out about when it's been working for us.
It's really exciting at the moment. But this is because devolution affords us the opportunity to look at that multi-complex, multi-dimensional jigsaw puzzle. So, you know, how can I say we'll have a pipeline? Well, we invested in something called Eureka, which, you know, there's one in Halifax, and all the little kids go there and they're having fun, but they don't realize, and they're learning STEM and STEAM stuff by doing all of that. So we've got this pipeline from kids at a young age. We've got AI in schools now. So we've got this pilot of AI in schools, which is actually started to generate an awful lot of interest. And the BBC put something out, and it's gone quite hectic, to tell you the truth, because we've seen in a very few short months, 6 months, a 10% improvement rate in the attainment levels of young people. So that's something that we're doing. And then we're moving through into sort of secondary school and trying to improve that. And then in the colleges, we've invested a lot in the estate, so improve facilities. And then, of course, we're targeting our funding to get people to the qualified levels that we need for the jobs that we've already got an assessment of through our skills development plan and our local growth plan. So we know all of these things. Nobody else could possibly do all of that. But that's why devolution has been so important to us.
I want to unpack a few of those themes. It's really fascinating. The first one is, you've mentioned a couple of times changes to the graduate premium, but also attracting talent or retaining talent here. And so one of the current big themes around social mobility is this notion of intergenerationally, things are not improving for this generation across the board, not just by social background, but across the board compared to parents. And one of the byproducts of that is even those who follow that Leave to Achieve model, you know, elite educational achievement, elite universities, elite employment, arrive in their professional jobs in the South, can't afford a house, can't save, families are forming later, they're having smaller numbers of children. I don't know if you've noticed, but so there's a report from the Institute of Fiscal Studies on graduate and non-graduate families, but and it talks about the kind of order that things happen. And compared to a previous generation, there are some changes around the kind of cultural aspects of marriage and families, but graduates typically will complete their education, meet their partner, usually move in together, probably buy a house, and then have children. And by the time that the children arrive, they're arriving into a 2-income family, quite secure and so on. I think I first got it wrong, because I actually think something else happens now, which is before they have kids, they buy a dog because they can't afford to buy the kids, have the children. And of course, they're having less children. So even that kind of model of social mobility is starting to pose questions to people about quality of life. Is it working? Why can't I buy a house until my 30s? Even when I'm in an apparently elite job, it's not necessarily paying back. But is that not an opportunity for places like Liverpool and Manchester, Leeds, Newcastle? Because actually, property is cheaper in the north. If we can create the economic opportunities and similar type of employment opportunities, then there's a lot to be said, isn't there, for saying actually that's one of the reasons why we don't see this spreading out of opportunity across the country. We've got this bigger gap between London and the other cities than other European countries do, for example. But are some of these changes good opportunities in terms of helping to accelerate that notion that actually the Leave to Achieve model, that's gone? Actually, you don't need to do that anymore.
It certainly makes the Liverpool City Region more competitive. And in some ways, I wish that things were starting to rise. So, for instance, our office per foot or per meter, whatever it is still lower than lots of others, which is an economic indicator that we're not pushing through, but it's going in the right direction, even though we don't want it to be too inflationary, because all of a sudden it'll put people off. So you have to, you know, it's like in most things, you know, that Laffer curve, we'll find the optimum point. But when we're talking about graduates and graduate retention, the University of Liverpool did a report a few years ago now And one of the factors in people saying that they weren't going to stay here was a lack of housing. So we need to address housing, not just for people, unfortunately, when we'd say at the sort of wrong end of the socioeconomic ladder, but for everybody. And that's why we're again, as a combined authority, we're able through a spatial development strategy to look at how we can get an acceleration of housing developments. And that's starting to really start to pay dividends, as I say, with more people staying. But also, that aspirational part should never be forgotten, because there are people who can't sort of find their way through that social mobility stepladder because, for instance, they can't get on the first rung. So assessing that, one of the main things was that they couldn't afford to take up low paid opportunities because they need that on the CV. So we've done something about that, whereby our public transport network, which is one of the things that came through in that survey with University of Liverpool, we've reduced the fares in the Liverpool City Region to £2. Now, there's London, as you know, has got quite a good transport. Yeah, it's fully integrated, and Greater Manchester have currently got £2, and we've got £2. Everybody else in the whole country has got more than £2. £2.50 is the next one closest to us, and then upwards. And we believe that we're doing our bit to try to facilitate that sort of that social mobility, where people could take up that job and be able to get to and from work.
Because the physical social mobility is really important, being able to get around.
It really is. I mean, but it puts a lot of people off. And then you'll start to see, the best time to look for a job is when you're in a job, as you know. So we get them into that, and then they have something on their CV to say, I've worked in such and such a place, which gives them the chances. So we look at it in the round, and the levers that we have, we're pulling them, I think, to try to create a different way in which the culture and the economic circumstances can come together. I'll just give you another example. We have got a fair employment charter, and that again is to get employers to understand their responsibilities over and above legislative and regulatory ones. And we've been able to persuade hundreds of companies. And one of the first things is that they have to pay the real living wage. So all of a sudden we've got tens of thousands of people's lives that have been improved, and that then affords them the opportunity, if they're stable and they've got a relatively decent income, although that's debatable whether we think the real living wage is even at the right rate. But at least then we've got that as a benchmark to try and move people forward.
Yeah, we certainly, in our data, the impact of the minimum wage, but even more so, we're a living wage employer as well, and even more so where the living wage is paid, you can see an uplift at the bottom end.
Yeah,
which is really important, because one of the things we've had is this stickiness about absolute income mobility since 2010, and that's underpinning a lot of the issues around cost of living and so on. And I suppose, so we've talked a bit about changing labour market, we've talked about dual pathways, we've talked about graduate retention, regional disparities and so on. The other side of our interests have been very much two themes that we think are really important, is shifting attention from the kind of high achieving poor to saying, actually, social mobility needs to mean something for everybody. It can't be just about upward mobility for a few. So the two words we've used to describe these are left behind places and people, and then what we describe within that as the truly disadvantaged. And when we look at places that are starting to improve, and we've described some of the achievements here, same would be true of Greater Manchester and other cities across the country. We've also then got these areas where it's still not touching them much yet. And you still tend to find that the higher achievers will leave, and those left behind in those places have got much lesser opportunities. And you're always conscious not to label those places, but we did a piece of work on place-based social mobility recently, and we compared two places in the northwest, Rochdale and Greater Manchester, with Macclesfield. And what comes over for us is a really strong sense that place matters to people in terms of their social mobility. They don't see as just being about their individual progress. They see it about their community, their family. There's a set of wider values and other issues involved, rather than just thinking it's all about that kind of education employment model. People take into a range of other things. But then we look at some of those local areas. So if we take somewhere like Knowsley, for example, where we know educational attainment has really been poor for a long time, and it's not, this is not a recent thing. And we can see very persistent patterns over a very long period of time. And it's not just Knowsley, it's the same places across the country. There's 20 or 30 post-industrial or seaside coastal places, some rural areas. They're always at the bottom. What do we need to be doing to bring them into the picture? Because clearly education is part of the story. It's not the whole story. We think the economy part is also important. Some of our data on social mobility is that when you have an enterprising and innovative economy, the people that benefit most are the least qualified. And that's because high-skilled people get paid well wherever they work. Whereas when you're in an innovative economy, the lower paid, lower skilled jobs, companies will keep them because of their tacit knowledge, not because of their qualifications. But for example, if you have a job, a fairly menial job in an innovative company, they want you because you know everybody, you know how the business works, you know what to expect. So your wages will go up faster and quicker. So that's part of the story. But the other side is, we've talked a lot about AI, we've talked a lot about the kind of higher skills we need, but it's that bottom 20% you mentioned at the beginning. What do we do about them, and how can devolution and local approaches help?
I think the first thing is that you spoke about data, and the world has changed, and we can be much more sophisticated in how we segment that data. We've got something, again, uniquely in the Liverpool City Region called a civic data cooperative. And the major agencies and organisations, so the NHS and our universities and the police and fire and ourselves as a combined authority and our universities, we've all got an agreement whereby that data can be shared. So we've got around the sort of the GDPR and all that, the sort of the stuff that obviously is really important, but we can segment data in a different way than anywhere else. In other words, we can interrogate those issues that you flagged up. So educational attainment, not surprisingly, is conjoined with health inequalities and with low income and with poor housing and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we can overlay all of this data now from different people, and we can almost predict in a postcode people's life chances. But that means that we can tailor innovations to try to improve those things. That's where we need to be as a country. I mean, if we get this right, and I think, there's some evidence that we can justifiably say that this is the best approach, but we'll need to test it over a generation, really, wouldn't we, to see whether those things work. But that's exactly what a combined authority is able to do, where a government just quite simply can't.
So there's definitely some things that are about scale. It's the locality, the local knowledge, but also the scale of the challenge. But let's take something like education. And we've had this debate this week, GCSE results. And every year we have the debate about GCSE results. But the theme that's come out very strongly yesterday is this notion of why. Well, there's two terms being used. One is white working class. But actually, it's not the white working class. Many working class people do really well. The kids do really well, and I teach in an FE college. Lots of the things that we teach people in terms of careers, hairdressing, construction, and so on, we're not teaching those because we think they're going to have poor outcomes. We're teaching them because we think they're going to have better outcomes. And actually, the skilled working class do much better. And one of the things we did when I first came to the commission was say, stop breaking things down into three groups. Think more sophisticatedly about the range of outcomes across different groups. And we've got it to 5. I'd like it to go to 7. But if you split what people call the working class in those two groups, the skilled working class outcomes are much better than the bottom 20%. They're really significantly better. And I think that's reflected yesterday in the debate about outcomes, because it's not the whole of the white working class. It's particularly free school meals, white students not doing so well. It's not just the white students. Afro-Caribbean students also do less well. But I think there's then a geographical aspect to that. So we see these high concentrations in certain areas, and you see this disparity about some places doing much better on GCSE and A levels than others on a regional basis. But it feels to me that we're good at naming the problem, but we haven't got a clue what to do about it. I mean, I've been in this business a long time, and I remember working in education in the 90s. After teaching here, I worked in Manchester. We had Excellence in Cities. Then we had the New Deal for Communities programme in East Manchester, which I worked with. We had an education action zone. We had training programmes, all kinds of things. Then subsequent to that, we've had opportunity areas. They're all in the same places. We could do a list of the top 25 places in the country. They're the same places since the 1990s. Why have we got no new ideas? And what would devolution help us do, which is not currently happening?
So I think you've identified not just the problem, but the response and the solution to the problem, because all of those initiatives are all top down. It doesn't work. Whitehall can come up with great ideas, but practically we're not homogenous, are we? Not everywhere is the same. So we need then to tailor, to bespoke that to certain areas. And that's what we're able to do. Even if it was a national policy, we could, chip its edges away and make it to the shape that we believe would fit into the needs of our local area. We still have really low attainment levels in some of our areas, but within a mile or a couple of miles of those really poorly achieving areas, we've got excellence and real pockets of high achievement. And what I don't think we've been brilliant at is sharing some of that that best practice across a wider geography. We've now got all the secondary heads really trying to work together. We've got our schools with the opportunity through AI pilots like the one that we've got, seeing whether we can free up some real time for teachers to concentrate on the cohort that needs the support, whilst of course the high flyers that they can get stuck into the likes of AI and other systems. And it's almost like we need a slightly different approach for everybody. And you have a look at all of the data, and it shows you that we're doing, as a city region, our schools are doing very, very well. But we sort of hit the buffers with kids around 14. And what, we need genuinely some serious analysis of why that starts to happen. Is it cultural? Is it about a lack of support? Whatever the reason is. Because if we could just keep them on the trajectory, they would be, they would achieve their full potential at that stage in their life. And that's what we need to provide, isn't it? I'm not saying that everybody is going to go to Oxford and Cambridge who's on this. Not everyone would want to, but at least provide them with the opportunity to reach their full potential. And if that happens to be MVQ level 2, so be it.
Absolutely. So in the technical and social mobility language, which the sociologists and economists use, they make a distinction between intergenerational, so compared to your parents, and intragenerational. And we think we don't talk about the second one, which is also, basically what it means is, have you got opportunities to improve over your life cycle? Forget the comparison, but you might start here, but you need to be able to improve. And I think that's absolutely missing from the whole debate. And there's a group. So as an educationalist, I look at this, and then you look at it in terms of the wider issue about inactivity in the labour market and all those other issues. It just feels to me that far too much of the collective system, and it's very, it's not a coherent system, is it? Doesn't place the individual development at the centre of their attention. So if you take, for example, the NEET issue at the moment, we've been doing quite a lot of work on NEETs. There's the official NEET numbers, and then there's what I call the shadow NEET system. The ones who actually, because they've got fit notes and largely for mental health, are out of the system. Yeah. They worry me more than the official NEETs. So, not least because there's a vicious cycle attached to what happens to them when they're not, when nobody's bothered with them, which is that we haven't got evidence on this for England. I would like us to do some work on it. But what are they spending their time doing? And the awful story in America is that all of those men who are opting out for the labour market, it would be great if they were playing a leading role in their families or doing other things, or that kind of thing would be great. But they're not. They're spending all their time on their own, gaming or looking at pornography. And these are just mentally damaging things to do. They're not helping them. It's not a good outcome. It's a bad outcome for the government. It's a bad outcome for their community. It's a bad outcome for their families. And then, and that's just an example. But I also think it's true in education. We've just got this core of 20% or so. You mentioned them at the beginning. They're coming out with very low literacy, very low numeracy. They're not doing well at college. They do something at college, and it's better they come to college than not. If otherwise they're going to be in that neat group. But their outcomes are not good afterwards either. But then the bit that really worries me is their family outcomes are really poor too. So when we start to look at some of the areas that people talk about as being left behind, you mentioned the interconnection between different things, the health outcomes and so on. One of the things that stands out for me is the difference in family. So I did a bit of work on our intake around what level of courses people are on and their family background. If you come from a big family where there's not two incomes, so it's 50% of our students included in that, you're more likely to be on to a level 1 course and live in a very poor part of town. And I don't think we're unusual. I think that's probably the wider pattern. If you match up that work I spoke about earlier on family formation for graduates with non-graduates, and these are caricatures, nobody's ever quite the average, but the story for non-graduates is increasing numbers of children born when the parents have never been a couple.
Yeah.
It's not that the family breaks up, it's they've never been a couple in the first place. In some towns in the country, it's over 40% of children. Yeah. It's really high numbers. And then, so you look at it and think, well, isn't one of the things that we need to somehow build a link between the educational outcomes for the children, what's happening to those families? Because we kind of let those families drift. Adult education, for example, budgets are tiny. So you've got the budget for Liverpool, but compared to the scale of the problem, it's tiny. And actually, do we have a great track record of getting the right people into adult learning? So that we're starting to think it's not just about their skills and their work, it's about their families. It's about thinking about the problem as a whole. So do you think that devolution has some opportunities to start to really get underneath the skin of that kind of joining up, which I think is quite radical and quite difficult to do? But I can't see how it can be done at a national level. And I think you're absolutely right when you say all those initiatives are top down and they don't look broad enough about the range of issues in a local area.
I'd say that we can't do things at that scale and expect that it's going to fit all the different bits of the jigsaw. We've got something called Households into Work, and basically you spoke about intergenerational unemployment and deprivation. This provides a wraparound service. It's much more than like you get with job search or whatever, but it has, just say for instance, it was a young girl and the dad or the mum or whatever, both of them could be unemployed because we're talking about that sort of passed down barrier to social mobility. It sort of helps both because they support each other, both trying to get into the world of work. And that might be that they need some debt counselling to get out of that spiral, or it might be that, alcohol or drug misuse or whatever. But we do all of that and then get them into a program of education, both of them. And then we've got some success in both ending up in the world of work, because as you quite rightly point out, if we don't do something, then the next generation just goes into that NEET group. And we've seen an increase of NEETs, the registered NEETs, and you're right about the unregistered, but we've seen the NEET group go through the roof really, and that's a real concern and worry for me. That's the bit that I hate, because I'd love to focus so much more onto that bit and getting that bit right, because that will have a knock-on consequence of everything else. But that's neat because they've come out of education. So the bit that we were talking about before is really important. Their experience in school needs to be enhanced. And I go back to the stuff that we're doing with the AI pilot with Century Tech. I was talking to David Davis, a Tory, yesterday, and we're seeing that if we can do stuff together, then potentially, and, you know, break down some of those party political barriers, because this transcends party politics, and try to see whether there's something that we can learn from what we're doing here that we can start to use elsewhere. And, you know, myself and David Davis, and hopefully we'll get somebody from the Liberal Democrats involved and all that, and we'll build a consensus by which we can start to see whether the tools that we've got, not just here, but in other areas, we can start to use that best practice to really improve the outcomes and the outputs. Because otherwise, all we're going to do is we'll provide some people with that opportunity to escape that cycle of, you know, low achievement and no employment and all of that. But we can do something, I think, collectively. If we can, it's something then that any future government, we would hope, will be able to use as a blueprint, because it would be non-party political.
I think that's fascinating and leads to my very final question. So again, another thing that we've highlighted in our work so far is the extent to which policy churn undermines achieving long-term outcomes. And we talked a bit earlier when we were looking out the window at the work here, same true of other areas. It's the long-term persistent vision for the city that allows you to start to turn things round. But wherever we look in education, skills, you know, how many ministers for skills have we had in the last 20 years? Probably 20. The education ministers change all the time. Then we end up with political arguments over what works and what doesn't, and they're actually political arguments, not evidence-based, and we lose that sense of continuity. One of the arguments for place-based approaches is actually, does that help us get around some of that, where you can start to do exactly what you've described? You could think, how do we build a consensus based on the right outcomes for the place? And if that's the case, what else needs to go into those place-based approaches which would help them work better? So we know you all have slightly different powers in your different devolution deals, but, you know, what else would help improve all the things we've just been talking about? So what about increased powers from the DfE? What about early years funding? What about apprenticeship money? What about to what degree do you need influence or to shape higher education funding and so forth? What, in our place-based strategy, what are the things you think we should focus on putting in there, and to what degree can that help accelerate the pace of change?
The perspective that I've come from is very much shaped by the fact that we do have devolution, but not everyone does have devolution. So what we probably collectively can do in those devolved areas is show you some of the innovation. It might not be the same for people outside. They might have other great things, but at least we have the platform to explain some of those things. And what we need to do is to look at where the genuine opportunities are for further devolution from the centre. And the one department that all of my colleagues all are critical equally of, and there's different nuances in different departments, but the one that they would pick out as number one that is the most difficult to work with is DfE. And DfE are a very centralist department. And we've spoken to Bridget Phillipson about this, and she's aware of our concerns. And we've put forward some suggestions on how we can break some of those barriers down. And if, for instance, we don't have any influence in schools, as many politicians don't, because all academies and all sorts of fragmentation, then it's really unfair that if there's a failure in regard to some of the kids leaving with very poor educational attainment levels, that a college, for instance, has to pick them up and try to provide the qualification level as a prerequisite for them to move into the world of work. So you've been in school for 11 years or whatever, you haven't really enjoyed it, you've not attained something, so let's put you back into a classroom. So we need more innovation and invention in trying to get people to those levels whereby they see I have to say the beauty of education, learning is a lifelong thing. And, sometimes somewhere somebody opens your eyes and you go, all of a sudden, oh my God, yeah, you see things in a different perspective. So we need to do more of that. And that means that devolution is a massive opportunity for us. I'd like to see post-16 budgets devolved. I'd like to see the apprenticeship levy spent in a slightly different way. And whilst I support MVQ level 7 qualifications, I think they are brilliant. If you have a look at a heat map, the City of London benefits most from that. And I would like to see that apprenticeship levy spent differently so that those companies in the City of London can pay for their own MVQ level 7s or equivalents or whatever these people are doing. It shouldn't be a substitute just because there's a pot of money there. We need to be using that apprenticeship levy funding better and getting better outcomes. We see a lot of people who start apprenticeships dropping off. And that's really disappointing. So is it that they're on the wrong trade, if you like, path, or that they're finding it too difficult? So colleges are really important to us, and that's why we work through locally all of our colleges. There's some unbelievable innovation that's taken place. So for instance, in the green industries, each one of them has picked a speciality instead of them all competing and doing one thing and then splitting the cohort so that it wasn't financially viable. So we've got all of that collaboration. I just think that governments are missing a trick of all persuasions, but my own government currently, as I said, I've said to them, if you want us to build more housing, then we can provide the pipeline of skilled people in the occupations where we know there's a skill shortage because we've done all that assessment. So trust us more to do some of the heavy lifting, and then we'll see better outcomes.
We think that the way in which social mobility has been used in policy has been so limited and restricted that some people start to feel actually it's not a very helpful concept. But the way we've worked on it in the last few years, we feel we've really interpreted it differently to try and help it contribute to exactly the kind of things you've been talking about. And I would still argue that it has an important role to play, because I think it's helped. If you look at our discussion, it's a useful concept to start to think about that whole range of ways we bring opportunities to people. And with that can come some focus and some sharpness about outcomes and making sure we're thinking about the whole community. And it feels like your approach in terms of place-based thinking very much fits with that. And it fits very much also with the notion that it transcends party politics, because it's about saying long-term, persistent, committed, evidence-based approaches are much more likely to work. And we feel the absence of those has very much held the country back. Steve, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. It's been thrilling to hear what's going on in Liverpool City Region. I wish you all the best with all of that. Hopefully we can come back at some point and do a progress update and see how some of those things have gone. But also thank you very much for helping us with our podcast. And we've got more work to come out on place-based approaches, and I will be able to reflect a lot of that, of what you've said today, in our work in the coming months. Thank you.
Great pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thanks, Steve.